On a planet where nothing was supposed to live, Ethan Walker saw something fall that refused to die. It came out of the night like a wounded star, dragging a white line across the black sky before disappearing behind the far rows of dust-choked irrigation towers. A second later, the ground gave a low, tired thump that traveled through the soles of his work boots and up into his knees. Ethan looked out over the fields from the porch of his farmhouse, one hand still wrapped around a chipped coffee mug gone lukewarm in the cold. The wind was already rising again, pushing red grit over the hardpan in thin, restless sheets. Out here on Meridian 6, the dark had a sound to it. Tin groaned. Loose wire sang. Sand hissed along the siding like something alive trying to get in. He should have stayed inside. That was the smart choice. On a world this far from the trade lanes, anything falling from orbit was usually trouble, and trouble had a way of sticking around longer than it should. But Ethan had lived alone too many years to ignore a sound like that. He set the mug down on the porch rail, grabbed his lantern, his dust mask, and the old utility pry bar hanging by the door, then started toward the northern fence line with his collar turned up against the cold. The night smelled like iron, engine smoke, and frozen dirt. His boots sank half an inch into powdery soil with every step. Ahead of him, beyond the dead soybean plots and the broken spine of a collapsed drone shed, a faint blue pulse flickered through the dust. Not steady. Weak. Breathing, almost. Ethan slowed as he reached the impact site. The thing that had landed was no cargo crate. It was a drop pod, narrow and scarred, half buried in a shallow trench it had carved into the ground. Its hull still ticked from the heat of re-entry. One side had peeled open just enough to show darkness inside. There were no markings he recognized, no registry code, no salvage tag, nothing but a smooth patch where some kind of insignia had been deliberately burned away. Ethan stood there for a moment, listening. The wind moved around the wreck in low, hollow tones. Somewhere overhead, one of his old weather vanes clanked on a loose bearing. Then he heard it. Faint. Uneven. A breath. He stepped closer and swept the lantern beam into the opening. At first all he saw was silver fabric, straps, and the dull shine of an interior gone dead. Then the light caught a hand. Slim. Blue as moonlit ice. Not painted. Not gloved. Skin. His jaw tightened beneath the mask. He wedged the pry bar into the warped seam and leaned his weight against it until the opening widened with a sharp metallic pop. The lantern shook slightly in his hand when he looked inside. A girl lay folded against the restraints, barely conscious, her head turned to one side, long pale hair tangled across one shoulder. Her skin held a soft blue sheen under the dust, and even in that freezing dark he could see the color had faded from cold and exhaustion. One of the restraints was still locked around her wrist. There was bruising there, ugly and dark against that unreal skin. Her lips were parted. Another shallow breath slipped out. Ethan did not know her name. He did not know her people. He did not know who had dropped her onto a dead planet and walked away. He only knew one thing for certain. Someone had thrown her out like freight, and she was still alive enough to notice. Ethan cut the last restraint with a utility blade from his belt and caught her before she slipped deeper into the ruined pod. Up close, she weighed less than he expected, all bone, chill, and exhausted stillness beneath layers of damaged silver fabric. Her skin felt cold even through his gloves. Not the kind of cold a person shook off with a blanket. This was deeper than that. The kind that had already settled into the joints. He pulled his coat open, wrapped as much of it around her as he could, then lifted her carefully against his chest and turned back toward the house. The wind met him head-on the second he cleared the trench. Red dust stung the exposed strip of skin around his eyes. The lantern swung in one hand, throwing weak yellow light over the furrows ahead, while the other arm held her close enough for him to feel the faint rise and fall of her breathing. It came in shallow pulls, uneven and fragile, but it was there. That was enough to keep him moving. Bye. The time he reached the porch, grit had collected in the seams of his gloves, in the folds of his collar, in the corners of her pale hair. He shouldered the door open and stepped into the farmhouse, and the sudden hush inside made the storm outside sound farther away than it was. The place was small, practical, and warm only by degrees. A pressure lamp glowed over the kitchen sink. Copper pipes clicked in the walls. The air carried the familiar smells of coffee grounds, machine oil, dry wood, and soup he had not gotten around to finishing. Ethan kicked the door shut behind him and carried her straight into the workroom off the kitchen, because that was where the heat was best. It had once been a storage room. Now it held a steel table, medical bins, spare pump parts, coils of tubing, and a battered heater unit that hummed loud enough to feel. He laid her down on a clean welding blanket spread over the table and stood still for one beat, looking at what the night had brought him. She was young. Younger than he had first thought. Not a child, but not much older than 20 by human guesswork, if human guesswork meant anything at all here. Her features were fine, almost carved, though strain had sharpened them. There was dust on her cheek, a split seam near one shoulder, and a dark pressure mark circling one wrist where the restraint had held too long. A narrow band of metal sat at the base of her throat, not jewelry, not quite a collar, too seamless to be either. He reached for his scanner from the shelf and passed it slowly over her body. The readout jittered, complained, reset itself, then offered him almost nothing useful beyond dangerously low body temperature, elevated stress markers, and a biochemistry profile the machine clearly hated trying to interpret. Ethan exhaled through his nose. "That makes two of us," he muttered. He stripped off his gloves, pulled a thermal blanket from the cabinet, and covered her from the shoulders down, tucking the edges around her with the same care he used when protecting seedlings from a hard freeze. Then he dragged the portable heater closer, checked the distance twice so he would not shock her system, and set it to low. He warmed filtered water on the stove, filled a rubber bottle, wrapped it in a hand towel, and placed it near her side. Nothing fast. Nothing reckless. Just heat, air, and time. He found the med kit he kept for farm injuries and sat on the stool beside the table, reading labels under the lamplight, discarding half of them because he did not trust human medicine inside an alien bloodstream. He settled for cleaning the abrasions he could see with sterile water and leaving the rest alone. Her eyelids moved once at the touch of the damp cloth. Not waking. Just reacting. He noticed then that someone had removed every emblem from her suit. The fabric had been cut clean where insignia should have been, and the small plate at her collarbone had been scraped so thoroughly it reflected only light, no name, no rank, no origin, nothing. That bothered him more than the pod. More than the missing registry. People hid identities for a reason. They erased them for worse ones. The heater breathed warm air into the room. Outside, the storm rubbed at the walls and windows. Inside, the metal pipes ticked softly, and the stranger on his table shivered once beneath the blanket before going still again. Ethan rested his forearms on his knees and watched to make sure she took another breath, and then another after that. He did not know what trouble he had carried home from the dark. But looking at the bruised wrist, the ruined pod, and the marks where a life had been stripped of its name, he had a feeling trouble had started long before she fell out of the sky. Lyra woke to heat, metal, and a smell she did not recognize. It was not the sharp sterile air of a medical bay or the perfumed stillness of a diplomatic chamber. This place smelled like iron, cooked grain, old coffee, and something dry and earthly beneath it all, like sun-baked wood after years of dust. For one disoriented second she thought she was dead. Then the ache in her limbs answered otherwise. It sat deep in the muscle and along the joints, heavy and slow, the kind of pain that belonged to survival, not endings. Her eyes opened to a low ceiling crossed with exposed pipes and a hanging lamp that cast a tired yellow glow over the room. The light hurt. She turned her head and saw shelves. Lined with tools, jars, sealed bins, coils of wire, and mechanical parts stacked with the practical order of someone who fixed things because no one else was coming. Not a cell. Not a ship. Not any place she had ever known. She pushed herself up on instinct, and the room lurched hard enough to make the edges of her vision blur. A blanket slid down from her shoulders. Cool air met the thin fabric of her suit. Her pulse jumped. She looked down. The wrist restraint was gone. The collar at her throat was still there, cold and seamless against her skin, but the locking band on her arm had been removed. That frightened her more than the restraint itself. It meant someone had touched her while she was helpless. Her hand moved at once, searching for anything she could use. A tool lay on the table beside her, no longer than 8 inches, blunt on one end and narrow on the other. She closed her fingers around it and turned toward the doorway just as footsteps crossed the kitchen floor. The human stopped when he saw her sitting upright. He had broad shoulders, work-worn hands, and the weathered face of a man who spent more time under bad skies than good roofs. Dust still clung to the seams of his shirt. He held a ceramic mug in one hand and a folded towel in the other. No weapon. No guards. No fear, at least not the loud kind. He only looked at her the way a person might look at an injured animal that had finally decided to bare its teeth. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The heater hummed. Pipes ticked softly in the wall. Somewhere beyond the house, the wind pressed against the siding in long, rough breaths. Lyra tightened her grip on the tool. "Do not come closer," she said, and her voice came out rougher than she intended, thin by dehydration and strain but still edged enough to matter. The human did not move. He lowered the mug to a nearby workbench instead, slowly enough that she could watch every inch of the motion. "All right," he said. His voice was low, steady, American in its shape, softened by fatigue and the habit of speaking to empty rooms. "I was bringing water." Lyra studied him for the lie, but if there was one, it did not show. He glanced at the tool in her hand, then back to her face. "That is a valve wrench," he added. "It is not much of a weapon unless you have better aim than you look like you do right now." She hated that he was probably right. The room still tilted under her if she breathed too fast. "Where am I?" she asked. "My farm," he said. "North end of Meridian, 6. About 3 miles from where your pod landed." Pod. The word settled into her chest like a stone. The fall came back in fragments. The sealed compartment. The silence. The final cold indifference of those who had sent her down without a name. Her expression must have changed, because the human did not press further. He only nudged the mug a little closer across the bench with 2 fingers and stepped back again, keeping the space between them clean and clear. "You passed out again after I got you inside," he said. "You were freezing." "I did what I could." Lyra looked from the mug to him, then to the room around them. Nothing in it suggested wealth, power, or organized intent. There were patched walls, repaired hinges, old tools polished by use, and a jacket hanging by the door with one elbow sewn twice in mismatched thread. This was not a captor's den. It was something more confusing. A home. "Why?" she asked before she could stop herself. His brow furrowed as if the question itself puzzled him. Then he answered with the same plainness he had used for everything else. "Because you were breathing." The words landed harder than any threat could have. Lyra had heard bargains, commands, titles, oaths, and calculated kindness dressed in expensive language. She had never heard mercy stripped so bare. The human picked up the towel again and draped it over the back of a chair. "My name is Ethan," he said. "You do not have to trust me. But you are safe enough for tonight." Then he turned slightly toward the kitchen, not leaving completely, not crowding her either, and gave her the kind of distance a frightened thing needs before it decides whether the hand in front of it means harm or shelter. The night settled heavier around the farmhouse after that, not quieter, but closer, as if the storm outside had pressed its face to the walls to listen. Lyra did not lower the valve wrench right away. She watched Ethan move through the kitchen with the caution of someone who had learned long ago that survival often wore an ordinary face. He took the kettle off the stove before it could whistle, poured steaming water into a wide ceramic bowl, and set a cloth beside it with the same patient care he had shown everything else. No sudden gestures. No false softness. Just a man working through the next thing that needed doing. It unsettled her more than cruelty would have. Cruelty had rules. It announced itself. This did not. Ethan pulled a chair a few feet from the work table and sat down backward in it, forearms folded over the top rail, giving her a clear line to the door, the room, and the water. You should drink before you try standing again, he said. Slowly. Your body is still catching up. Lyra said nothing. Her fingers had begun to ache around the metal wrench. The heat in the room was reaching her now, thawing sensation back into places that had gone dull on the way down. It made everything sharper. The stiffness in her shoulders. The bruised tenderness at her wrist. The weight of the collar against her throat. She hated that he was right about the water. She hated more that he had not forced it on her. After a long moment, she set the tool beside her leg without letting it go entirely and reached for the mug. The ceramic was warm against her palms. Steam touched her face. She took one careful sip, then another. The water tasted faintly of metal and minerals from deep ground filtration, but it was clean, and the warmth spread through her chest in a way that made her realize how close to shutting down she had been. Ethan watched her only long enough to confirm she could keep it down, then looked away toward the heater, as if he understood the mercy of not making survival feel like performance. There is soup, he said. It is plain, but plain is probably safer. Lyra let the mug rest in her hands. You keep speaking as if I am fragile. Right now, he said evenly, you are. The answer should have insulted her. Instead it lodged somewhere beneath the pride she was struggling to hold together. She studied him more carefully then. He looked to be in his late 30s, maybe early 40s, though hard weather could add years where comfort never would. His face was lined at the eyes from sun and glare. His hands were rough, scarred in the harmless way of labor, and darkened by grease that did not quite wash out. There was nothing polished about him. Nothing ceremonial. Yet there was order in the room, quiet competence in the way every object sat within reach of another. A man alone, making a life from repair. How long was I here? She asked. About 6 hours, Ethan said. You woke once before sunrise for maybe 10 seconds. Did not say anything I could understand. Her gaze sharpened. I spoke. A few words. He shrugged one shoulder. Could have been names. Could have been curses. I have heard enough of both not to take it personally. That almost caught her off guard. Not enough for a smile, but enough to break the hard edge of the room for half a breath. Ethan stood and reached for a small pot on the stove. The smell that rose from it was simple and unfamiliar, vegetable stock thickened with grain protein and root starch, cheap farm food made for cold weather and long workdays. He poured a little into a bowl and brought it only halfway before stopping again, letting her decide the rest of the distance. Lyra took it with both hands. The bowl warmed her fingertips at once. She stared into the pale steam curling upward and realized she could not remember the last meal she had been given without condition attached to it. A title. A protocol. A demand. Ethan leaned one shoulder against the workbench and glanced at the seam of her suit where the insignia had been cut away. Whoever sent you down did not want you recognized, he said. It was not quite a question, but it asked one anyway. Lyra went still. The room seemed to narrow around the words. Outside, a loose panel on the shed roof banged once in the wind, then again. Ethan must have seen something close in her face, because he lifted a hand slightly. You do not have to tell me, he said. Not tonight. Not tonight. As if he was offering time instead of trying to take answers. Lyra lowered her eyes to the soup. The surface trembled faintly with the movement of her hands. "You should not have brought me here," she said at last, her voice quieter now, less like a blade and more like a warning given to someone too decent to understand the danger. "Maybe not," Ethan replied. "But I did." She looked up. There was no challenge in his face. No heroism either. Only a plain, stubborn acceptance that some choices did not become mistakes just because they came with consequences. The heater breathed warm air into the room. The pipes clicked overhead. The farmhouse held around them like a thin shell against a very large dark. Lyra took another spoonful, then another, and for the first time since the pod opened above a dead world, the cold inside her loosened enough to make room for something more dangerous than fear. Relief. Morning came slowly to Meridian 6, not with bird song or softness, but with the faint rattle of old pipes and the thin gray light that filtered through dust-coated windows like something tired passing through. Lyra woke on the worktable beneath the thermal blanket, no longer shaking, but still wrapped in that strange halfway state between weakness and awareness, where every sensation arrived 1 second late and stayed too long. For a few moments she did not move. She only listened. The storm had weakened sometime before dawn. In its place she heard smaller sounds now, domestic sounds, almost embarrassingly ordinary. The low hum of the heater. The scrape of a chair leg across the kitchen floor. The soft clink of ceramic. A cabinet door closing with care instead of force. It was the sound of a life continuing. That unsettled her in a different way. She turned her head and saw Ethan through the open doorway, standing at the counter with his back half-angled toward her, pouring something from a dented metal pot into 2 mugs. He moved with the steady economy of someone who had repeated the same motions for years without needing to think about them. Outside, the world was dead stone, frozen dirt, and iron wind. Inside, this man still made coffee in the morning. The thought caught at her unexpectedly. She pushed herself upright more carefully this time. The room did not spin as hard. Progress. The blanket slipped to her lap, and she noticed that at some point during the night, someone had folded one corner over itself so it would not drag against the floor if she stood. A tiny adjustment. Thoughtless, perhaps. Or thoughtful in a way so small it barely counted. That made it worse. Grand gestures could be distrusted. Little ones got through the armor. Ethan glanced back when he heard the blanket shift. "You are up," he said. "That is a good sign." He picked up one mug, thought better of it, and set it back down. "Coffee is probably a bad idea for you. I made broth too." Lyra swung her legs over the side of the table. Her boots were gone. Someone had set them neatly on the floor beneath the bench, cleaned of dust. She stared at them for a beat before slipping her feet in. "Do you always talk this much?" she asked, her voice still rough from cold and sleep. Ethan looked mildly offended for about half a second. "No," he said. "Only when somebody wakes up looking like they might fall over and pretend they are fine." That should not have been funny. It was not, exactly. But it came close enough to surprise her. She rose slowly, one hand braced against the steel table. Her legs held. Barely. Ethan noticed the small victory without calling attention to it. He only reached for the larger mug and carried it to the edge of the workbench, then stepped aside. Broth, as promised. Steam lifted from the surface in thin white ribbons. "Sit first," he said. "Pride burns more calories than soup gives back." Lyra lowered herself into the chair because arguing would have wasted energy she did not have. The mug warmed her hands immediately. She took a careful sip and tasted salt, root starch, and something herb-like he had probably grown himself in a window box because shipping costs this far out made fresh food a luxury. The simplicity of it did something dangerous to her chest again. She looked past him into the kitchen. The place was even smaller by daylight. A narrow table. 2 chairs. Hooks by the door holding a weather coat, a hat, and a set of worn work gloves. A shelf lined with spare filters and seed packets. No decoration except for a faded photograph tucked into the corner of a mirror frame. She could not make out the face in it from here, only the shape of a younger Ethan standing beside an older woman with the same tired eyes. "You live here alone," she said. It was not a question. "Most days," he answered. "Some days the machines keep me company." He turned back to the stove, checked a pressure gauge near the wall, and gave one of the copper pipes a light tap with his knuckle when it buzzed too hard. Everything in the house seemed old enough to fail and cared for enough not to. Lyra watched him in silence, trying to place the feeling growing beneath her ribs. It was not trust. Not yet. Trust required history. This was something less certain and more immediate. A loosening. A brief suspension of the instinct that had kept her alive among people who smiled while calculating her value. Ethan opened the icebox, took out a folded cloth, and held it up. "Your fever is down," he said. "I want to check your wrist again in a little while. After you eat." Lyra's hand went unconsciously to the mark left by the restraint. "You keep giving instructions," she said. "Occupational hazard," he replied. "Plants die if you ignore what they need. People are not that different." She looked at him over the rim of the mug. "I am not one of your plants, Ethan." He met her gaze then, calm and direct, with no sign that he felt challenged by her edge. "No," he said. "You are not." The answer hung between them, simple and exact. No teasing. No argument. No need to win. Somehow that did more than kindness alone could have. Lyra lowered her eyes first, not out of surrender, but because the room had become too warm in a way the heater could not explain. Ethan turned to rinse a bowl at the sink, giving her back the privacy of her own thoughts. Through the window beyond him she could see the long stretch of pale land outside, the irrigation tower standing crooked against a bruised morning sky, and the faint scar in the distance where her pod had come down. The world beyond this farmhouse remained merciless, empty, and large enough to swallow names whole. But inside this house, a stranger had given her water, heat, and silence when she needed silence most. Lyra wrapped both hands around the mug and let the warmth settle into her palms. Somewhere between the dead planet outside and the patched-together refuge within these walls, she had crossed into unfamiliar territory. Not safety. Not yet. But something close enough to make leaving feel harder than it should have. The day stretched thin and colorless beyond the farmhouse windows, the kind of winter light that never seemed to fully arrive, only hover over the land as if it had doubts about staying. Ethan spent the morning moving through his chores with Lyra at the edge of his awareness and the world outside pressing in like a warning he could not yet name. He checked the water recycler twice, reset a stubborn fuse in the pump shed, and cleared red dust from the intake vents with a stiff brush while the wind dragged long ribbons of grit across the yard. Through it all, he found himself glancing back toward the house more often than usual, as though part of him still expected the whole thing to vanish if he looked away too long. When he stepped back inside near noon, bringing cold air and the smell of iron dirt in with him, he found Lyra standing by the kitchen window in one of his flannel overshirts, the sleeves rolled past her wrists twice and still hanging low over her hands. The sight stopped him for half a beat. The shirt was far too large on her, its faded blue checks soft with age, but it had done what clothes were meant to do. It had made her look less like something dropped from the edge of a nightmare and more like a person who had been cold and was trying not to be anymore. She turned at the sound of the door. The weak daylight caught in the silver of her hair and along the fine lines of her face, but the sharpness there had eased since morning. She still looked tired. Still too pale beneath the blue. But alive now in a more convincing way. "You should not go out there alone," she said before he could speak. Ethan set the brush on the counter and peeled off his gloves. "That is interesting," he said. "Most people start with hello." Her gaze flicked once toward the front yard, toward the open stretch beyond the fence line where the land ran flat and exposed for miles. "I am serious." "So am I," he said, though. Not unkindly. He washed his hands at the sink, letting warm water run over knuckles reddened by the cold. This farm does not keep itself running. Lyra folded her arms, then winced faintly as the motion pulled at a sore muscle she had not meant to reveal. Ethan noticed and pretended he had not. That, she was beginning to understand, was one of his stranger forms of mercy. He did not press on weakness unless he needed to keep it from becoming worse. "You think they will come back," he said, drying his hands on a clean towel. It was not accusation. Just a plain arrangement of facts. Lyra was quiet for a moment. The heater hummed under the window. Somewhere in the back room, a pressure valve clicked. "I know the kind of people who erase names," she said at last. "They do not leave loose ends." Ethan leaned one hip against the counter and studied her without crowding the silence around the words. "Then I guess we both know something useful now." She looked at him, genuinely unsettled. "You say that as if this changes nothing." "It changes plenty," he said. "It just does not change what happened last night." She frowned slightly. "Meaning?" "Meaning you were freezing to death in a broken pod, and now you are standing in my kitchen arguing with me. Seems like an improvement." For a second Lyra only stared at him, caught between disbelief and something softer she did not have a name for. Then her eyes shifted past him to the faded photograph tucked into the mirror frame. "Who is she?" she asked. Ethan followed her gaze. His expression did not harden, but it settled into a quieter shape, one that seemed older than the lines on his face. "My mother," he said. "She ran this place before I did." Lyra waited. He did not look like a man who filled silence for comfort. "She used to say if you have heat, water, and one spare bowl, then you have enough to help somebody," he added. "Drove me crazy when I was younger." There was a thin thread of humor in it, but grief sat underneath, not loud, not dramatic, just worn smooth by repetition. Lyra looked back at the photograph. The woman in it had Ethan's eyes. Tired, steady, and warmer than they first appeared. "She is gone," Lyra said. Softly. Ethan nodded once. "4 winters now." He said it the way farmers said weather reports. Not because it meant little, but because some losses became part of the climate of a life. The kitchen fell still around them. Light gathered pale and weak on the table. Dust traced slow lines against the outer glass. Lyra had known palaces where no one spoke plainly, where every sentence hit a knife or a contract. In this small room, a man had offered her the one thing rank had never guaranteed her. Honesty without performance. Ethan pushed off the counter and reached for a sealed container on the shelf. "You should eat again," he said. "And after that, I want to check the scanner one more time. Make sure your temperature is holding." Lyra watched him set a plate on the table with the same practical gentleness he seemed incapable of turning off. Bread warmed on the skillet. Sliced root vegetables. A little preserved fruit he probably saved for days that deserved better than average. She looked at the meal, then at him. "You do this for everyone?" Ethan gave her a sideways glance while he poured water into 2 glasses. "No," he said. "Most people do not fall out of the sky into my north field." It was such a dry answer, delivered so evenly, that something inside her shifted before she could stop it. Not laughter exactly. She was too tired for that. But the shape of it brushed her voice when she spoke again. That was almost funny. "Careful," Ethan said, setting a glass in front of her. "You are healing. We do not want to rush things." Lyra lowered herself into the chair and wrapped her fingers around the cool glass. Outside the house, the planet remained what it had always been, empty, hard, and patient in its cruelty. Inside, there was bread, warmth, a dead woman's kindness still living in her son's habits, and a silence that no longer felt like suspicion alone. It felt like 2 strangers standing at the edge of understanding, not ready to cross it yet, but no longer pretending the distance between them was endless. The warning came just after sunset, when the sky over the western flats turned the color of old bruises and the farm lights began to matter more than the dying day. Ethan was in the pump shed, replacing a cracked pressure seal when every monitor on the property gave the same sharp electronic chirp, one after another, a chain of alarms passing through the yard like a startled flock. He froze with the wrench still in his hand. Motion alert. Low atmospheric approach. Unregistered descent. For 1 second the only sound in the shed was the soft hiss of venting pressure and the distant rattle of wind against sheet metal. Then Ethan set the wrench down and moved. By the time he stepped back into the yard, the air had changed. The usual empty vastness above the farm was no longer empty. 3 lights hung high over the northern ridge, pale and steady, not stars and not weather. Lyra was already at the front window when he entered the house, her face gone still in a way he had not seen before, every trace of warmth from the afternoon burned out of it. She did not ask what the alarms meant. She knew. "They found me," she said. The words were quiet, but they landed in the room like a door closing. Ethan crossed to the control panel by the kitchen arch and checked the external feeds. The cameras showed the same thing from 4 angles, a sleek shuttle descending beyond the outer irrigation towers, too clean in its lines for freight, too deliberate in its approach for a navigational mistake. No registry transponder. No colony code. Just a ship settling through the dust with the calm certainty of something that expected to be obeyed. Could still be survey, Ethan said, though they both knew it was not. Lyra turned from the window to look at him. No, she held his gaze for 1 beat, and in that beat he saw something he had not let himself name until now. Not just fear. Recognition. The kind that came from knowing exactly how far another person would go if they had already decided your life was inconvenient. Ethan looked back to the monitor. 2 figures had disembarked. Then a third. Their suits were dark, sealed, formal in a way that made working people nervous. No tools. No crates. No field gear. Nobody came to help dressed like that. "All right," he said, already thinking through the property in pieces. Front approach, pump shed, grain bunker, crawlspace beneath the old greenhouse, manual cutoff for the east floodlights, blind spot. Near the collapsed drone barn. His mind moved the way it did in storms, not faster exactly, just clearer. "We do this my way." Lyra blinked once, thrown by the steadiness of him more than the words themselves. "Your way. You can barely outrun a bad chair right now," Ethan said, opening a drawer beneath the radio console and taking out a handheld scanner, 2 flash beacons, and a coil of utility cable. "So yes. My way." Under different circumstances, she might have objected. Instead she stood there in his oversized flannel shirt with her hands clenched at her sides, and for the first time since waking in his house, she looked less offended by his authority than shaken by the fact that he was willing to claim it on her behalf. A soft chime sounded from the exterior speaker near the porch. Then a voice, filtered through static and cheap hardware, smooth in all the ways real concern never was. "Resident of Meridian Agricultural Tract 17, it said. This is a regional biosecurity retrieval team. We are conducting a lawful recovery of hazardous off-world material. Please open your residence and cooperate." Ethan looked at Lyra. She had gone pale under the blue. "Hazardous," she repeated, almost to herself, and the word carried an old bitterness that made the room colder than the evening outside. Ethan keyed the speaker on but did not unlock the door. "Funny," he said, voice flat. "Most biosecurity teams lead with medical support, not legal language." Silence answered him for half a second. Then the same smooth voice returned. "Sir, you may be in contact with a contagious non-human subject." Ethan's eyes moved once to Lyra's bruised wrist, then to the bowl she had used at lunch, still drying on the rack beside his own. Contagious was not the word men used for a person they wanted alive. It was the word they used when they needed neighbors not to ask questions. "I have seen contagious," he said. "You do not sound worried enough." He cut the speaker before they could reply and turned immediately to the breaker panel, killing the outer floodlights in 3 zones with a practiced hand. The yard beyond the windows dropped into patchy darkness, leaving only the dim pole lamp by the water tower and the pale spill from the house itself. "What are you doing?" Lyra asked. "Making them." "Guess," Ethan said. He pressed one of the flash beacons into her hand and guided her toward the back hall. "Listen to me carefully. There is a storage cellar under the greenhouse. It is insulated, shielded, and smells like fertilizer, so nobody sane enjoys searching it. You go there if I tell you. Not before." Her fingers closed around the beacon, but she did not move. "Ethan." He looked at her. There was too much in her expression now for either of them to sort through quickly. Warning. Guilt. The beginning of trust. "If they are who I think they are," she said, "they will not stop because you ask them to leave." "Good thing I was not planning to ask twice," he said. Then he reached past her for the old weather coat hanging by the door and draped it around her shoulders, rough canvas still carrying the faint warmth of the house. It was such an ordinary gesture that it nearly undid her. Outside, the shuttle engines wound down to silence. Gravel crunched under approaching boots. The night held its breath around the farmhouse. And in that small kitchen at the edge of a dead world, Ethan Walker stood between the door and the girl someone had tried to erase, as if the difference between property and person could still be defended by one human being who refused to step aside. The first knock on the door was almost polite. That was what made it worse. It came through the farmhouse in 3 measured taps, softened by old wood and distance, as if the people outside believed civility could make a lie easier to swallow. Ethan did not move toward it. He stood with one hand resting near the breaker panel and listened to the silence that followed, the kind of silence trained people used when they expected fear to do half their work for them. Lyra remained near the back hall with his weather coat around her shoulders and the flash beacon cold in her hand. In the dim light, the coat made her look smaller than she was, less like a figure from some distant, untouchable world and more like someone who had been forced into surviving too many rooms that did not belong to her. The speaker outside crackled once. Then the smooth voice returned, patient and false. "Resident, you are obstructing an authorized containment process. Open the door and no further disruption will be necessary." Ethan kept his eyes on the shadowed front window. "Funny word," he said quietly, mostly to himself. "Containment." Lyra looked at him, and in her expression there was something close to grief, but sharpened by experience into something more useful. "They do not want to recover me," she said. "They want to remove what I know." Another knock followed, not louder, just firmer, as if procedure had advanced to the next line. Ethan turned from the door then and crossed the kitchen in 2 strides, taking her by the elbow only long enough to guide her into the narrow pantry alcove beside the old cooling unit. It was dark there, hidden from the front room unless someone came all the way in. He crouched to open the lower vent panel, revealing a recessed switch box and a folded scrap of paper tucked beside it. When he pressed the switch, a muted click sounded somewhere out behind the greenhouse. Lyra frowned. What was that? Diversion, Ethan said. The greenhouse lights are on a separate relay. If they move to check it, we buy time. For what? She asked. Ethan looked up at her, and for a moment the whole house seemed to narrow around the answer. For the truth, he said. Because I think that is what they are really afraid of. The words landed harder than she expected. She had known generals who spoke of truth like a ceremonial virtue, something displayed when useful and buried when costly. Ethan spoke of it the way he spoke of weather or water pressure, as a thing with consequences no matter what anyone preferred. Outside, boots shifted on the porch boards. One of the visitors moved closer to the window, and a narrow beam of scanning light passed briefly over the kitchen wall before sliding away. Ethan lowered his voice. I need you to tell me exactly one thing. If they take you, does this end with you? Lyra went still. The question reached deeper than fear. It reached the one place she had spent days, maybe longer, refusing to look directly at. Her fingers tightened on the beacon until the edges bit into her palm. "No," she said. "It ends with records, witnesses, and everyone who still remembers the names they erased." Ethan held her gaze. "Then I was right." "About what?" "About them not being scared of what you are." His face hardened in a quiet, almost disappointed way. "They are scared of what happened to you being known." Something in Lyra gave way at that. Not her caution. Not her training. Something older and more private than either. She had spent so long being handled as risk, leverage, inheritance, protocol, burden. Even those who had once sworn loyalty to her bloodline had spoken around her instead of to her, as if her value was too large to let her remain human in the middle of it. But this man from a dead farm world had seen the scraped insignias, the bruised wrist, the false retrieval claim, and reached the simplest conclusion in the galaxy. Someone had done wrong, and wrong did not become right just because it arrived in an official shuttle. The speaker crackled again, and this time the false courtesy had thinned. "Final notice. Open the residence." Ethan straightened slowly. "That is usually when people start making bad decisions," he murmured. "Ethan." He paused at the sound of his name in her voice. It was the first time she had said it without suspicion wrapped around it. "You do not understand who I am," Lyra said. He turned back. The dim kitchen light caught at the lines in his face and the dust still clinging to one sleeve. He looked tired, steady, and completely unwilling to perform awe and command. "Then tell me," he said. Lyra swallowed once. For a second the only sound was the soft shudder of the heater and the wind rubbing grit across the outer glass. "My name is Lyra Vale," she said. "House Vale of the Ninth Accord." Even now the title felt strange in her mouth, as if it belonged to someone buried under layers of ash and politics and ceremonial language. "I was not sent away because I was weak. I was sent away because I am the last legal heir to a charter they rewrote in secret. There are records encoded in my collar. Orders. Transfers. Names. If I disappear, their version survives." Ethan's eyes flicked once to the seamless band at her throat, then back to her face. He did not step back. He did not stare. He did not suddenly become careful in the artificial, grasping way people did when they realized rank had entered the room. He only nodded once, absorbing the information like a man being told the storm had shifted east and would now hit the north field first. "All right," he said. Lyra blinked. "All right? Means I understand enough." He reached up and adjusted the collar of the weather coat around her shoulders, rough hands gentle from habit rather than performance. "You are not cargo. You are evidence." The sentence struck her harder than any title had. Not because it reduced her, but because it restored something the titles had stolen. Personhood. Injury. Fact. A wrong done to a living being instead of a dispute over inheritance. Outside, the porch boards creaked again. Then came the dry metallic sound of someone trying the door handle. Ethan's jaw set. He picked up the old battery lantern from the counter and pressed it into Lyra's free hand beside the beacon. "Greenhouse cellar if they breach the front room," he said. "Count to 10 after the lights cut, then move." "And you?" she asked. He gave a faint, humorless exhale that was not quite a laugh. "I own 6 acres of bad soil, 3 irrigation towers, and more stubborn wiring than any sensible person should trust. I will improvise." For the first time since the pod opened over a dying world, Lyra felt something rise inside her that was not fear and not relief. It was sharper than hope and steadier too. A recognition that the universe, for all its cruelty, had placed one impossible thing between her and erasure. A human being who did not care what she was worth on paper. Only that what was done to her should not be allowed to stand. The front latch shuddered once under pressure from outside. The house seemed to pull in around them, every pipe and board holding its breath. Ethan stepped toward the door, broad shoulders squaring in the half-light, while behind him Lyra stood with his coat around her and her real name finally spoken aloud. In that moment, she understood something her own people had forgotten long before they betrayed her. Power could command silence. But dignity, once recognized by the right witness, was much harder to bury. The lights cut out so cleanly it felt less like darkness arriving and more like the house choosing a side. 1 second the kitchen held the weak yellow glow of old bulbs and heater coils, and the next it was all shadow, breath, and the thin red blink of emergency indicators buried in the walls. Outside, the greenhouse relay flared to life exactly as Ethan had promised, flooding the far end of the property with sudden white light. Through the front window, bright shapes swung in that direction at once. A voice barked from the porch, sharper now, stripped of its practiced calm. Then came the sound of boots moving off the boards, quick and certain, drawn toward the new target. Ethan did not waste the opening. "Now," he said. Lyra moved. She crossed the back hall with the lantern held low and the weather coat tight around her shoulders, every step still weak but steadier than she had been the night before. Behind her, Ethan slipped through the mudroom, cut across the utility shed, and opened the greenhouse service hatch with the ease of a man who had built half his life around broken hardware and backup plans. Cold air rushed up from the cellar below, thick with the scent of soil, plastic trays, dormant roots, and the sour trace of fertilizer. Lyra descended the narrow steps and turned once at the bottom. Ethan was above her in silhouette, broad against the spill of pale greenhouse light, one hand on the hatch frame. "Stay until you hear my voice," he said. "Not theirs. Mine." Lyra wanted to say something larger than fear, larger than thanks, something equal to what he had done just by refusing to hand her over when the easy version of the night demanded it. But there was no time for anything ceremonial. So she only held his gaze and nodded once. Ethan lowered the hatch and the cellar folded around her in cool dark and muffled silence. Time changed shape down there. Every second stretched. Every small sound turned important. She could hear the faint hum of the lantern in her hand, the tick of cooling pipes overhead, the dull scrape of motion somewhere beyond the greenhouse walls. Once, very faintly, she heard voices. Once, the old structure trembled as if someone had opened and closed a door too fast. She stood between shelves of dormant seedlings and stacked nutrient bins, breathing carefully, one palm pressed to the smooth collar at her throat where the encoded record still slept. Evidence. That was what Ethan had called her. Not burden. Not asset. Not heir. Evidence. A living witness to something wrong. The word had rearranged something inside her. She had spent so long surviving titles that she had forgotten the simpler truth beneath them. Before she was a claimant, before she was leverage, before she was an inconvenience to men who rewrote law in hidden rooms, she was a person somebody had tried to discard. And one human farmer on a dead world had looked at that fact and decided it mattered. Minutes later, or maybe an hour, a different sound rolled across the property. Not boots. Engines. More than one. Larger. Deeper. The vibration moved through the cellar walls and into the soles of her borrowed boots. Then came a burst of static from somewhere above, followed by voices speaking in clipped, urgent tones she did not recognize at first. After that, silence again. Not empty silence. Changed silence. The kind left behind when momentum had broken and the next move belonged to someone else. Lyra waited until the hatch opened and Ethan's face appeared overhead, lit from below by the lantern glow and from behind by a cold blue spill from the yard. He looked exhausted. Dust streaked one sleeve. A fine crack ran across the lens of the handheld scanner clipped to his belt. But he was standing, and that was enough to make her chest loosen. "It is over," he said. Lyra climbed the steps slowly. When she emerged into the greenhouse, the night outside no longer belonged to the shuttle that had come for her. Another vessel had settled beyond the water tower, its hull marked with the old crest of the Ninth Accord, faint but unmistakable in the floodlights. Two figures in formal field armor stood at a respectful distance near the gate, weapons holstered, helmets off, posture lowered in the old sign of sworn recognition. Loyalists. Real ones. Somebody, somewhere, had still been listening for a signal the traitors thought they had buried with her. Ethan led her back toward the house through rows of frost-coated grow beds and cracked irrigation tubing silvered by moonlight. The farm looked smaller now beneath the arriving ships, more fragile perhaps, but no less real. At the porch steps, Lyra stopped. The old boards creaked softly under the wind. Through the open door she could see the kitchen lamp restored to life, the plain table, the drying bowl by the sink, the faded photograph still tucked into the mirror frame. Everything was exactly where it had been. That nearly undid her more than the danger had. One of the armored figures approached, then halted several feet away and bowed from the shoulders. "Lady Vale," he said, voice low with relief he was trying not to show. "We received the emergency wake code embedded in your collar. We came as soon as we could." Lyra looked at him, then at the ship beyond the yard, then back at the farmhouse that had held together under weather, grief, and one impossible choice. "I know," she said. But her eyes had already moved to Ethan. He stood with his hands in his coat pockets, tired enough to lean a little into one hip, as if this had all been another long repair job that had gone on later than expected. There was no triumph in him. No demand to be thanked properly. No sudden hunger for significance now that rank had arrived to witness what he had done. He only looked at her with the same quiet steadiness he had offered from the beginning, as if he still saw the girl in the pod before he saw the air in the yard. "You should go," he said. Lyra held his gaze. The wind lifted a strand of her silver hair across her cheek and pulled at the collar of his weathered jacket. Around them, engines idled low and patient under the stars. "I was thrown away," she said softly. "And you treated me like I was still alive." Ethan glanced once toward the dark fields beyond the fence line. "Seemed obvious," he said. The answer was so plain, so completely human, that for a moment Lyra could not speak. All the languages of court and command had nothing to add to it. She reached up instead and touched the collar at her throat. The seamless band released with a soft click, unlocking under her own pulse pattern now that allied systems were near. From within its inner groove she slid a thin silver seal, no bigger than a coin, etched with the crest they had tried to erase from her suit. She stepped forward and placed it in Ethan's rough palm. His fingers closed around it by instinct. "What is this?" he asked. "Proof," Lyra said. "That someone in this galaxy still knows the difference between saving property and saving a person." The loyalists waited without interruption. They understood, perhaps better than most, that history sometimes turned on moments too small for official records. Ethan looked down at the seal, then back at her. "Take care of yourself, Lyra." It was not dramatic. Not a vow. Just a sentence spoken like a man meaning every ordinary word in it. Lyra felt the weight of departure settle at last. She nodded once, because anything more would have broken the fragile shape of the moment. Then she turned and walked toward the waiting ship. At the ramp she stopped and looked back. Ethan was still on the porch, one hand resting on the rail, the kitchen light behind him casting a long warm rectangle into the cold yard. Small house. Bad soil. Patchwork pipes. One human being standing where the universe had expected no witness at all. The hatch closed behind her a minute later, sealing in blue light and low engine hum, but the last image she carried with her was not of the traitors who had tried to erase her or the crest restored to her name. It was of a farmer on a dead planet, holding a silver seal in a grease-rough hand, as if mercy had always been practical work.